Some solar panel production lines are moving out of China. The shift follows new U.S. import restrictions on products tied to forced labor. Supply chains are shifting back to the U.S. A new bill aims to help boost that process, especially for American semiconductor manufacturing. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is calling on Americans to watch an award-winning film. He calls the movie an honest, scathing indictment of the Chinese Communist Party. The European Union takes action against China to back one of its member countries. Now, the organization is launching a case against the Chinese regime with the World Trade Organization. And thousands of blossoms go up in flames. A Hong Kong flower farmer is cutting his supply in half ahead of the Lunar New Year holiday. That's after strict pandemic measures sent demand on a downward spiral. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In energy news, it looks like some businesses are moving their solar panel production out of China. Reports of forced labor used in the supply chain and new import restrictions put in place by the U.S. mean businesses are looking elsewhere. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Parts of the solar supply chain are moving away from China, accelerated by evidence of forced labor. Fred Rockefort is an attorney at Harris Bricken. He has many years of legal experience in China and is a contributor to the award-winning China Law blog. Rockefort says a lot of companies are moving to Southeast Asia.
Vietnam, like Thailand, like Indonesia, that while perhaps smaller in terms of overall capacity when compared to China, they still have pretty significant industrial bases.
Rockefort says these countries have been manufacturing for a long time, and they are close to China and its supply chain. Rockefort says forced labor isn't the only thing driving companies away.
There's actually legal obstacles right now in place for the importation of these solar products coming into the United States.
President Biden recently signed a bill into law that bans all imports from Xinjiang unless companies can prove that forced labor wasn't used.
Our laws regarding forced labor in the United States is that the analysis that has to be carried out applies not just to the finished product, but to the entire supply chain of that product.
David Amster-Olszewski is the CEO of SunShare, which builds community solar farms. Amster-Olszewski says he's seeing factories being built in India and Mexico as well.
Our panels come from all over the world. We've ordered them from Southeast Asia, from Canada, from 10 years ago from China.
However, China still dominates in the solar industry with 8 of the 10 top manufacturers.
Solar cells are made primarily from silicon. Once you have the silicon, you have to create the cell itself. And that usually is done at another manufacturer location. And then those cells are shipped out to the manufacturers to actually assemble them into a solar panel.
Dale Rolfe is the head of business development at Pacific Sun Technologies, a residential solar provider in Southern California. He says China has the bulk of the silicon as well as many of the other materials.
They have a lot of minerals in their soil, so they have a lot of the resources that we need to produce solar panels, and they can control the price in that regards.
Meanwhile, America's solar industry is relatively weak.
The cost of labor is very high in the United States, especially for these types of tasks, and we have a shortage of workers.
But the United States could potentially see the industry grow soon.
Tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration 4 years ago on solar panels coming from anywhere in the world other than the United States, and they're close to 20%. So the United States sees some of the highest cost for solar panels in the whole world right now.
David Amster-Olszewski, the CEO of SunShare, says Biden will review these tariffs next week. Whether or not the tariffs are thrown out is something the American solar industry is watching. Don Ma, NTD News.
This week, the House unveiled a bill that Democrats say would increase U.S. semiconductor manufacturing and boost competition with China. Why is it so important, and why is China considered a threat to the industry if most of the advanced chips are made in Taiwan? NTD's Chenny Wu explains.
Lawmakers are trying to find ways to ease the shortage of semiconductor chips in the United States. They're an essential part of electronic devices.
Everything from airplanes and appliances to automobiles depend on these chips that really represent the electronic brains of modern products.
Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Stephen Ezel, says the semiconductor industry is crucial to the U.S. economy.
As a $200 billion industry, it supports 280,000 U.S. jobs directly, another 1.6 million jobs when you consider downstream effects.
U.S. firms are the global leaders in chip design and development, accounting for almost half of the global market share. But most of the chips are made outside the United States.
America's share of global semiconductor fabrication has declined from 37% in 1990 to 12% today. That makes the United States dependent on other nations for its chip supply.
But today, 75% of the production takes place in East Asia. 90% of the most advanced chips are made in Taiwan. China is doing everything it can to take over the global market so they can try to outcompete the rest of us.
So what makes China the major semiconductor competitor? Ezel says first is Beijing's Made in China 2025 strategy. It aims to replace the U.S. and other foreign exports and domestically manufacture 70% of the chips it uses by 2030.
This is damaging because this is not the way the international trade system is supposed to work. Countries are supposed to welcome trade and production based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage.
Second is China's massive industrial subsidies, which hurt other global competitors in the industry.
So if the basis of how China is trying to compete is not on private enterprise-led, rules-governed, market-based terms, then it can be very damaging to other competitors across the ecosystem.
The third reason is national security.
Capabilities of semiconductors have a very significant influence on the capabilities of military weapons and platforms. It's concerning is to the extent which China is using these technologies as part of its military civil fusion program.
The military civil fusion strategy is a plan that seeks to integrate private sector innovations into the Chinese military. In order to keep the U.S. technological edge amid China's threat, the House recently introduced a nearly 3,000-page bill. It aims to strengthen the supply chain and invest in American manufacturing and scientific research and technology, securing global competitiveness. Most importantly, it includes $52 billion in semiconductor production subsidies to boost domestic chip production. The Senate passed its version of the bill last summer with bipartisan support. But for the House bill, there are still some disagreements. Our Washington, D.C. correspondent Melina Weisskopf says, for one, Republicans are concerned with the timing.
Democrats are pushing through bills rather quickly and that they don't get a chance to actually do debate, research, and have a prolonged period of time to look into the bill.
Plus, some Republicans are disappointed the final version didn't include action to further prevent intellectual property theft by Chinese Communist Party spies. So what is the next step?
It's going to take at least until next week before they can actually get something through.
Weisskopf said the bill is expected to pass. Then it'll have to go back to the Senate for another vote before it can reach Biden's desk. Chenny Wu, NTD News.
Not made in China seems to be trending in some areas. A South Korean company is trying to sell itself by emphasizing they are not Chinese. South Korea's LG Energy Solution says it is aiming to become the world's largest manufacturer of electric vehicle batteries, dethroning China. And it seems to be a good time to do it. A senior researcher at the Korea Automotive Technology Institute tells the Wall Street Journal that China is having a hard time entering the U.S. and European market because of the ongoing trade war. Meanwhile, LG Energy Solution says it can overtake China because it doesn't rely solely on the Chinese market. Right now, China's contemporary Amperex technology, or CATL, leads as the world's largest maker of EV batteries. That company generates 80% of its revenue from within China, which LG Energy CEO Kyung Soo says is a weakness. He says they have a more diverse client base in the U.S. and Europe. They also have production bases in these regions to supply their clients, which CATL does not have. Kwang says having the lead in terms of more global clients will increase their market share in the future. LG Energy's expansion plans are already underway in 6 countries. That's including an investment of $4.6 billion in a joint factory with General Motors in the U.S. Research company SNE estimates CATL's global market share was around 32% last year, while LG Energy's was second at 21%. A new development for U.S.-China diplomacy. Washington says it has asked the People's Republic of China, or PRC, to change its virus prevention requirements for American diplomats there.
We have longstanding concerns regarding the PRC's quarantine and testing policies that run counter to diplomatic privileges and immunities. We've discussed this issue with PRC authorities, both here in Washington and in Beijing at different levels, and we've recommended what we think are a series of reasonable options that would be consistent with COVID-19 mitigation measures and at the same time align with international diplomatic norms and practices.
Earlier this week, U.S. diplomatic staff inside China reportedly made a request to the State Department to let them and their families leave China. That's according to CNN, citing sources familiar with the matter. The request came amid growing concerns about China's strict pandemic containment measures, including some policies that could separate parents and children and force people to stay in government-controlled quarantine centers for weeks. The U.S. Embassy to China currently has an agreement with Beijing that parents will remain with their children while under quarantine. But U.S. diplomats worry Beijing could reverse that deal. Chinese authorities don't take kindly to the diplomats' request to leave. A spokesman for China's foreign ministry called Washington's logic puzzling and noted that China is seriously concerned and dissatisfied. It is unclear if the diplomats' request is linked to Washington's latest request to Beijing to loosen its virus prevention requirements for American diplomats. Now we look to an award-winning film that's playing on the big screen in 30 cities across the U.S. Posting on Twitter, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the film is a moving, honest, scathing indictment of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. He adds the truth of Xi and his predecessors' utter depravity and the power-driven horrors they've inflicted cannot be denied. This movie unsilences the wonderful Chinese people. Go see it. The film is based on a true story.
More than 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners protested peacefully in Beijing.
Practitioners gathered on the streets outside the Chinese Communist Party.
The protagonist is Wang, a student at a top Chinese university.
In 1989.
Wang practices Falun Gong, a meditation practice that follows the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. But Wang's life was turned upside down overnight. That's when Beijing launched a persecution campaign against Falun Gong in 1999. The regime later stepped up the campaign, churning out propaganda to defame the tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners. Now, Wang meets Daniel, a jaded, cynical American reporter. Together, they risk their lives to expose Beijing's deadly propaganda.
Begged me to get you back there, whatever it took.
I cannot sit by and watch them be manipulated
into turning against each other.
The government is conducting one of the largest scale propaganda campaigns in history. You just want to wait for it.
What are you going to do? Walk into the prison and demand to see him?
Get out of China. Expose their lies to the world.
Unsilenced is in select theaters until February 3rd, including New York, Washington, D.C., and California. A Chinese diplomat is accusing the U.S. of inflicting pain on children in Afghanistan, but the photos are fake. The diplomat is China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian. Posting a series of photos on Twitter, Zhao wrote, "After 20 years' war, this is what the U.S. has brought to the children in Afghanistan." But the photographer who took the photos is debunking Zhao's claim. In a tweet, the photographer, Ali Haz Suleiman, says the photos were not taken in Afghanistan, but in Idlib, a city in Syria. He adds that this is what the Syrian regime and Russian forces brought to the children in Idlib, not what the United States brought to the children in Afghanistan. The diplomat Zhao Lijian has since deleted his tweet. The European Union is backing Lithuania. The union launched a case against China at the World Trade Organization. That's for what it calls discriminatory trade practices against its member country. Beijing blocked most trade with Lithuania after Lithuania deepened ties with Taiwan. And Beijing's punishment has also expanded to companies in Europe that use Lithuanian components. NTD's Cos Temenis has more.
The European Union said it has launched action against China at the World Trade Organization, or WTO, for discriminatory practices against Lithuania. The EU said China put in place coercive measures against Lithuanian exports, and China is cutting its exports to Lithuania. European Commission Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis says the EU's attempts to resolve the problems bilaterally have failed.
These measures are a threat to the integrity of the EU single market. They affect the intra-EU trade and EU supply chains, and they have a negative effect on EU industry. This is why we are stepping forward to defend EU's rights.
WTO challenges start with a formal 60-day period of consultations between the parties. If they do not resolve the dispute, the EU can request that a WTO panel rule on the matter.
If we find a solution and the coercive practices are being discontinued, of course, then we do not have the reason to pursue the case further.
China said it acted in accordance with WTO rules, and its issue with Lithuania was political. Lithuania broke with diplomatic custom by agreeing the Taiwanese office in Vilnius would bear the name Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei. Beijing expelled the Lithuanian ambassador and withdrew its own ambassador. Lithuania also closed its own embassy in the Chinese capital. Cos Temenis, NTD News.
A Lithuanian woman living in Taiwan suddenly found herself becoming popular. Locals are expressing their support for her motherland. This is after the European country stood up against the Chinese Communist regime.
Irina is originally from Lithuania. She met her Taiwanese husband 18 years ago, and now she lives in Taiwan with her husband and son. She expresses her gratitude to Taiwan in her mother tongue.
Thank you, Taiwan people, for your passion and support.
In the past, very few people in Taiwan knew much about the Baltic state, but now it's a different story.
In the past, as I say, I came from Lithuania. Many people would ask where Lithuania is. They hardly had an idea. But recently, there have been a lot of news about Lithuania. So when I say I come from Lithuania, everyone says, wow, you come from Lithuania, welcome. Then they'll say, thank you for your vaccines. Thank you, Lithuania, for supporting Taiwan.
The Chinese regime has been pressuring Lithuania with economic sanctions, and people in Taiwan are backing Lithuania in response. Irina shares one of her many experiences.
But when I was buying meat buns recently, I met a young man. After he got to know that I'm from Lithuania, he said that he wanted to buy Lithuanian rum. The liquor was supposed to be exported to China, but now the Chinese regime sanctions it, and it doesn't allow it in.
Irina admits she's worried that the Lithuanian economy would suffer from China's retaliation, but she says she supports the Lithuanian government because nothing is more important than supporting a democratic and free country.
Taiwan is a free country. That's a key point. Take the economic cooperation as an example. The cooperation will not entirely stop just because the government suddenly says something, like what is happening in China, because Taiwan respects human rights and observes economic rules. The important thing is that the government can't intervene in economic activities.
Lithuania's strong stance against economic pressuring from China is drawing international support. The U.S., the EU, and some other countries have spoken out in support of Lithuania.
Flower farmer Leong Yat-sun has burned thousands of blossoms this year, all because he can't sell them fast enough. That's due to Hong Kong's stringent measures against the Omicron variant, which have cut Lunar New Year demand in half. 70-year-old Leong runs a traditional flower farm, growing sword lilies, water lilies, and tulips. He had planted 200,000 flowers ahead of the Lunar New Year holiday season. But due to the crash in demand, about half will end up in flames.
These beautiful flowers are completely healthy, and I would normally pick them and bring them to the market. Look how pretty they are. But due to the epidemic, this year there is no flower market at all.
Hong Kong's government announced earlier in January that traditional Lunar New Year flower fairs in around 15 districts would remain closed this year. Later, locations traditionally used by wholesalers were also put under traffic restrictions. Government figures show compensation has been offered to license holders of the Lunar New Year flower fairs, but Leong said he has received nothing as a farmer.
It is a horrible burden to go through, but I cannot just talk about how bad it is for me. I have to power ahead and hope that tomorrow will be better.
The Chinese Communist Party virus, which causes COVID-19, has turned Hong Kong into one of the world's most isolated cities. Residents returning there from more than 160 countries are required to quarantine for 14 days, followed by 7 days of self-monitoring. Hong Kong reported nearly 170 new infections on Thursday, a record high since the pandemic started. The Chinese regime is updating death toll numbers tied to the flood in Henan province last July. Officials now say the number is higher than previously reported. The record flood and disastrous aftermath shocked the nation last year. The Communist Party blames local officials for ignoring flood warnings and covering up the damage. But some Chinese residents worry similar tragedies could strike again.
Chinese authorities say the real death toll of last July's flood in Henan province is higher than reported. They are now blaming local officials for covering up the scale of the disaster. The local authorities initially reported 99 deaths. Then they changed it to about 300 under public pressure. Now, according to a newly published investigation report by the CCP's Central Authority, the death toll is nearly 400. They arrested 8 local officials and will punish dozens more. The report also blamed local officials' poor handling of the flood. Despite 5 extreme flood warnings from weather agencies, the party secretary of Henan's capital city, Zheng Zhao, ordered the public transportation system to continue operating. He also ignored the weather agency's suggestions for flood prevention measures. That partially led to hundreds of people being trapped in the subway and road tunnels. Footage of the trapped passengers and flooded tunnels shocked the nation. Officials reported dozens of deaths, but many Chinese residents remain highly suspicious of that death toll, and they're asking the authorities to release the names of the victims so they can confirm which lives were lost. One netizen commented that this is a man-made disaster caused by officials' inaction. If Zheng Zhao had suspended school and work one day in advance based on a warning of heavy rainfall, there would be far fewer deaths. This time it was Zheng Zhao. Will the next time and the next time and the next be the city you and I live in? Chinese authorities have a history of concealing the death toll and human errors in natural disasters. And it's been rare for them to admit that. In the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, officials reported that 5,000 children were killed. That's because over 7,000 school buildings collapsed. Many were substandard. But parents suspect the real toll to be higher. And Amnesty International has called the regime out for harassing and arresting parents who are seeking justice for their dead or injured children.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.